Welcome everybody to the latest episode of a series I like to call History Speaks. Now, on today's show, I'm delighted to meet a writer focusing on the Tudor era. Amy's first book, Educating the Tudors, was published in 2023. The second, Women's Lives in the Tudor Era, was published in 2024. Now, Amy is currently working on her third book, Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and she spends much of her time reading and researching. She publishes reviews on her blog and has been a guest on other blogs and podcasts. But today, she's here with us. So please give a warm welcome to my guest this week, Amy McElroy. Hi, Amy. How are you?
Hi, John. I'm good, thank you. Got Storm Erwin with us today as well, so I do apologise if you hear any background wind or anything. We're getting a bit battered here, but other than that, I'm great, thank you.
Today, we're going to be talking about your new book on the intriguing life of Mary Tudor, not the Bloody Mary, as many seem to get the two confused. Now, before we start, I do like to ask a little question to break the ice, so to speak. So, if you weren't an author, what do you think you would have most liked to have been?
Well, I actually still am a civil servant, so I do still work full time. So ultimately, it would be that, because I kind of got into writing as a bit of a hobby, writing reviews. Ultimately, it was somewhere for me to keep track of what I've read, share my thoughts with other people, and then it expanded from there. So ultimately, I'd just still be doing my day-to-day job, I expect. So not as fun.
I thought you were going to say you wanted to be a film star or something like that. Or...
No, I wanted to be a vet when I was little, but I didn't want to see hurt animals, so that kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? So, yeah.
So let's get on to your questions. So, how did you first become interested in history, and what's your background?
So, my background, I was born in Liverpool. I went to school. I did A-levels. Surprisingly enough, I didn't do history. And I know it's a bit of an odd one, but people always say, why didn't you do history? And it was largely because when I was at school, you got the options of either geography or history. You couldn't do both. And this is going to sound really bad, but at the time, I really didn't like the history teacher. And I just couldn't see myself enjoying 2 years. So I ultimately picked geography. Do I regret it? Yes. Have I ever used geography since? Nope. So, but that's the way I went. And then I went to uni to do criminal justice and then postgraduate law. Ended up in bar management somehow. And then ultimately joined the civil service. And I've been there for quite a few years since. I won't say how many because it'll give my age away. But yeah.
There's a lot of subjects that you do at school, isn't there? And you think, how is this going to help me in my future career? And I think maths is one of them. And possibly RE, as they used to call it, education, that's another one. I mean, the only things you really need are like your English and your maths. As long as you can speak and add up, and you know what wage you're going to get at the end of the week, and you can work out your tax, that's probably the main two, aren't they, really?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I learnt in maths I've never used.
You don't?
So I think it's good in a way, but I've never used most of it. So
do you remember?
Maybe they could turn it into helping with budgeting or something like that is along the lines of arithmetic, but not what they actually teach.
But do you remember maths at school when they used to give those books for sines and cosines and things? When do you ever use a cosine in everyday life?
Yeah.
It's like,
or pi. When do you use pi? Because I don't.
Unless it's a meat pie.
Maybe I'm meant to. I don't know, but I don't.
Or a poker pie or something like that.
Yeah, different type of pie.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going off track here. Your interest in the Tudors is prolific, but what first drew you to that dynasty?
It was actually the Plantagenets. So, I was interested in the Plantagenets, and obviously as you go through the Plantagenets, you ultimately end up with the Tudors, and that's really where my first interest came from. So I do still love everything about the Plantagenets. I think they're incredibly interesting. But I did fall in love with the Tudors, the different monarchs, the society at the time. So yes, it was through the former dynasty that I became interested in the Tudors.
And I think possibly that's a good way to get into that family, isn't it? Because you need to know the background.
Oh, yeah.
Forward sort of thing. You know, you can't just... You can make opinions about the Tudors, but if you know a little bit about that background as well, it's obviously going to help.
Yeah, definitely.
Much, especially when you're writing books and things. Now, your passion for the Tudors is not only captivating, it's fascinating to hear how your journey began. So let's now turn to one of its iconic figures and explore the inspiration behind your latest work. Now, your latest book is about Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. What gave you the idea to cover such an iconic lady?
My first book, Educating the Tudors, quite self-explanatory, talks about the different types of education that were available at the time, Henry's education, and then about his siblings, so Arthur, Margaret, Mary. And I became interested in the differences between Henry's education and his sisters. And I've begun to realise that there was much more to Mary than meets the eye. So I began digging. And the more I looked into Mary, the more fascinating I found her. So ultimately, I just kept digging, kept going down rabbit holes. And yes, so I think she's very underestimated. And I think she's truly fascinating for the Tudor period. So yeah, it was actually through Henry and his education that sparked my interest in Mary as an individual.
I think the thing with Mary as well is I do videos on YouTube, etc. I've made a couple of videos about Mary Tudor, and she's very, very popular, even though she's not really talked about like in the same breath as Henry VIII or his wives.
Yeah.
But she's still a really popular person.
Yeah, she is. And I know that if you just say Mary Tudor, you mentioned it at this earlier. There's the first person you think of is her niece, Mary I of England. But I think once you start looking at her as an individual, yeah, there's a lot to her. So she's a very interesting individual.
Yeah, and it's a great story as well. But anyway,
yes.
Exploring, I guess, what inspired your latest works gives us a great insight into the process behind bringing these historical figures to life. So, speaking of early milestones in her extraordinary life, let's delve into an intriguing moment from Mary's childhood. Now, it's quite remarkable that at the age of just 3, Mary found herself in a potential marriage talks. Now, how did that come about?
Well, 1498 is the first record that we have of any kind of approach for Mary's hand in marriage. At that time, you've just mentioned she was about 3 years old. Henry VII, her father, was actually approached by the Milanese ambassador on behalf of the Ludovico Sforza, who was the Duke of Milan. Now, he was requesting Mary's hand on behalf of his son, Massimiliano, can never say that the first time, who was the Count of Pavia at the time. So Sforza was in a dispute with France over the Duchy of Milan. And he made a request of Henry for 3 things. So the first one was he wanted Henry's support in his claim for the Duchy of Milan. The second was he wanted the Order of the Garter to be bestowed upon him. And then lastly was Mary's hand for his son. So Henry very diplomatically, very politely declined this, well, according to the Milanese ambassador. So Henry essentially said, I can't support you because ultimately England and France are friends. As a secondary of that, that is also the reason why I can't bestow the Garter on you, because the Garter is the badge of the First Order of King Arthur and the Knights of his round table, so to speak, and it was worn by his friends. And those friends are essentially the enemies of their enemies. So because the King of France was a member of the order, the Duke Sforza therefore couldn't be a member because there was a conflict there. With regards to Mary, he essentially said she's 3 years old. He wouldn't consider any kind of betrothal until she was at least 7. But he did say when she reaches 7, he is happy to treat on the matter again at that point. So that was according to the Milanese ambassador. For the Venetians, they essentially said that Sforza's son was not of, Mary was not of the Duke's condition, which essentially meant she's too good for him. She's a princess. It's not the right match. So they said it a bit more insultingly, but essentially the same thing, that, yeah, she's too young and not of the right status. So, but yeah, she was only 3 years old.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that somebody so young would be put forward for marriage. I mean, it's ridiculous. And it would never happen today. Well, you would hope it would never happen today, but
yeah,
it is ridiculous. I guess Mary's involvement in marriage negotiations then highlights just how intertwined politics and personal lives were in those times. And as the story unfolds, it's clear that her later unions carried greater significance. Now, she became Queen of France, but what were the repercussions of her marriage to Louis XII?
So, Henry VII had actually agreed that she would be betrothed to Prince Charles, who was the grandson of Maximilian, Holy Roman Emperor, and Ferdinand, King of Spain. Those two were very prominent in Europe at the time. And that would have been an exceptional match for Henry, like a very successful match. However, Ferdinand and Maximilian did keep stalling things. They kept putting things off, agreeing that it would happen, and then something would cause a delay. The plan was for Mary to leave and go and spend some time with Margaret of Austria, who was Charles's aunt, and learn all about their customs and essentially grow up there until she became old enough for the actual marriage to take place. Because of all the delays, ultimately Henry VII died before anything happened, and Henry VIII took the throne. Henry initially continued the negotiations as his father had started. He himself obviously married Catherine of Aragon, and that kind of put a stopper on any disruptions that Ferdinand was planning, because he was ultimately saying, I will agree this marriage once you marry Catherine. But once that had happened, they'd come up with all other things. So Charles was ill, or they ultimately agreed that the marriage had to take place by the time Charles reached 15. So that was the agreement. But they still kept pressing Henry for money for troops, or to borrow troops for their individual wars and things like that. And both of those, Ferdinand and Maximilian at the time, were against France. They did make peace with France behind Henry's back, which I think was probably the last straw in Henry thinking, I am done. Like, I'm not taking any of this anymore. So Henry made peace with Louis. And part of that was for Mary's hand in marriage. And I think ultimately it was a huge shock to Maximilian and Ferdinand that not only had this young king outwitted them, but they'd now lost the opportunity of an English princess. So she was off the cards. Louis and Henry were now friends. They didn't have anything to withhold for Henry. So I think it was a massive shock to those two incredibly powerful men that Henry had done that, and ultimately it brought peace to England and France through that marriage. So a very smart move on Henry's part, I believe.
It's unreal to think that her proposed marriages are not of her doing, and I guess we could touch on this later, I suppose. But the first one, as you said, was the Habsburg Charles, set up by her father. The second one to Louis, ignited by her brother Henry. Yet none of these were in the best interests of Mary, or maybe they were, I don't know. But it must have been a tough few years for her. Now, eventually, she chose maybe, or forced, Brandon, after he had agreed with Henry and the Privy Council not to propose. Yet, as Henry found out about the marriage, he was obviously furious. Do you think the couple were really lucky to escape execution?
My personal opinion is I don't think they were ever close to execution. I believe Henry pretty much knew what would happen. So he essentially made a promise to Mary before she left for France that if she outlived Louis, she could choose her own husband. Now, whether he meant it at the time or whether it was just brotherly words of, my little sister's leaving, I've got to give her something for encouragement. But she does refer to it in letters later on, so I do believe that promise was made. And he allegedly also made Charles Brandon promise that when he left for France to essentially collect Mary and bring her back to England, that nothing could happen. So I think why would you make somebody promise that if you had no inkling that that was going to happen? So I think Henry's response and reaction to their marriage was ultimately a face saver, that he knew he had to react because the nobility would react. They would not be happy that yes, at the time he was a duke, but he was essentially not born of the nobility, had ended up marrying a princess of England and now a dowager queen of France. So Henry was well aware that he'd have to placate the rest of the nobility and his council in some way. We know that Wolsey was instrumental in that peacekeeping talks, if you want to call them that, between the couple and Henry. But yeah, I don't believe they were ever close to execution. I think Henry was aware that something would happen. He may have thought they might wait until they got back to England, but I think he ultimately had an idea that something would happen, and I think his reaction was a way to save face in front of the nobility and maybe make some money out of it at the same time, because obviously Mary had to hand over a lot of her jewels and plate in an apology to him. So, yeah.
Who do you think forced the issue then, Charles or Mary? I.e., you asked who?
I think it was probably Mary, because she was in France. She knew that for the benefit of France, she should stay there. So her dowry and everything was French property, was her income, all of that kind of thing, her pension as Dowager Queen. France would want that to stay in France. They're not going to want their money going back into England. So ultimately, they would want her to stay. And she was well aware of that. She wasn't stupid by any means. So I think she probably knew that either if I don't do anything now, there's a chance that Francis, the new King of France, is going to try and force her to marry somebody else in France. Or if she does make it back to England, there's a chance that Henry may go back on his promise and marry her elsewhere because, she's back on the marriage market technically. So there was nothing to stop Henry going back on his word and marrying her elsewhere. So I think she knew that and reacted in what she thought was the best way to not only get what she wanted, but make sure that when she did get back to England and that she could get back to England, she wouldn't be forced to stay in France, that ultimately she had chosen her next husband. So I think it was Mary.
I'll go with that then. I'll go with Mary. I mean, their ability, I guess, to avoid the full wrath of Henry is remarkable. And it speaks also about the precarious nature of court politics at the time. But their actions must have had wider implications, especially on that international stage. Now, although she married Brandon in secret, they did have a public wedding a couple of weeks later. But how do you think the French felt about this, given a new peace treaty had just been ratified between the two countries just 5 days later?
I think the French probably would have been a little put out because they were losing a princess and a dowager queen. So they'd lost that opportunity for a match within France. But I don't know, it kind of had a peace element as well, that if she's married to Brandon, there's nothing to impact their peace talks and things like that. So I think they'd have been upset about the fact that we're losing this income, we've lost the opportunity for a marriage match within France. But then I also think there was probably people that were very glad that she'd married Brandon, for instance, Louise of Savoy. I don't think she was a huge fan of Mary or Brandon. So I think for her, it was the best course of action because, she got rid of both of them. They both went back to England. So depending on the individual opinions, I think they're a little bit put out about the monetary side of it, the financial aspects, but ultimately I don't think there was that much fuss caused over it. And obviously Francis was at the wedding, so ultimately if the king's happy with it, the rest of them have got to be.
I mean, did before this whole marriage became, when the two became one, I don't know what I'm saying here, I'm all over. When the marriage first occurred, did Mary have any say at all in going, or was it just that she had to go and do this marriage with Louis?
That is a good question. I believe that because of their relationship and how close they were, if Mary had ultimately refused, then I don't think Henry would have forced her to go. But she was brought up knowing what her duty was, both to England and to the monarch, which happened to be her brother. So I don't think he would have forced her, but I don't think she would have had much say at all. I think she just knew what her duty was, and she knew that Louis was old. The chances of her outliving are exceptionally high. So could she go through that, ultimately come out as a Dowager Queen of France and possibly the mother of the heir to the crown of France? Was it worth that when ultimately, if she refused, she would have just been married elsewhere? So maybe she just kind of thought, well, it doesn't matter who I marry because I have to marry someone that is my duty. So I think that's what she did.
So despite, I guess, all the political implications, she was still referred to at court as the Queen of France, but when the rocky roads she tread were passed, she did eventually, I guess, move to the countryside and began a new life away from court, and one that seems to have been much happier. Now, what do we know about Mary's children with Charles?
We actually know quite a bit, fortunately, or in some cases, not fortunate for them. So their first child was a boy. So Henry Brandon, he was born in 1516. You can probably assume he was named after his uncle. But sadly, he died in 1522, so 5 or 6 years old. Their next child was Francis. So Francis was born in July 1517 at Hatfield. And she had Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary as her godmothers. Unfortunately, neither of those could attend the christening, so there were two ladies sent in their absence. So there was Lady Elizabeth Grey, who stood in for Princess Mary, and a Lady Boleyn, who stood in place for Catherine of Aragon. So there is a bit of a mystery around who the Lady Boleyn is. So it could have been either Elizabeth Boleyn, who was the mother of Mary and Anne, or it could have been Anne Boleyn, who was the wife of Edward Boleyn. But either way, they stood in for Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary. So Francis would go on to marry Henry Grey, who was Marquess of Dorset at the time when they got married. So the marriage actually took place at Suffolk Place, which was one of Brandon's properties, and Henry VIII was actually at the wedding. That is one of Mary's last big public appearances at the marriage of her daughter. Obviously, we know that Frances would go on to become Duchess of Suffolk, and she was the mother of Lady Jane Grey, Lady Catherine Grey, and Lady Mary Grey. So big connections there in the Tudor court. Not going to delve into what happened with her daughters, but ultimately, after Henry Grey died, she did go on and marry again. So the person that she married after that was Adrian Stokes, who was essentially part of her household. So wasn't necessarily on the same status rank as she was, but it looks like it was a fairly happy marriage. There was no children to survive infancy with Adrian, and Frances would die in 1559. She's actually buried in Westminster Abbey, so she's got a very nice tomb, so if anybody wants to go and visit it, that's where she is. The next daughter was Eleanor. So Eleanor was born in 1519, and she was betrothed to Henry Clifford, who was the heir of the first Earl of Cumberland. So they were betrothed in 1533, but they didn't marry until 1535. So Mary had passed by that point, so she didn't unfortunately get to see the marriage of her second daughter. But Eleanor would go on to have 3 children, if I remember correctly. So she was the mother of Margaret Stanley, Henry Clifford, and Charles Clifford. She died 1547 and is believed to be buried in Skipton. And their final child was a boy, so again named Henry, and he was born in 1523, so after his brother had passed away, hence they used the name Henry again. And he was actually created the first Earl of Lincoln by Henry VIII in 1525, so Mary did get to live through her son being created an Earl, so that would have been huge favour for Mary. He was actually intended to marry Catherine Willoughby, but we all know what happened there. And he would sadly die in 1534. So it was only actually the two daughters that would ultimately survive into adulthood and carry that name forward. She did have two stepdaughters that she ultimately took in, that were Brandon's children from a previous marriage. So she had them brought to live with her when they were back in England, and it looks like they had a very good relationship as well. So they were there as mourners for her funeral and stuff. So yes, we fortunately know quite a bit about her children with Brandon.
It's interesting that you said there that about a burial at Westminster Abbey. Why was Mary not buried at Westminster Abbey?
Mary died at Westhorpe, so in Suffolk, and I believe that she actually loved her home at Westhorpe, was very, very well thought of in the area. So she was originally buried in the cathedral at St Edmunds. Sadly, Reformation, she was moved. I don't know why Henry didn't have her moved to Westminster Abbey, but ultimately, I can imagine that by that point, she'd been laid to rest. I don't think Henry quite foresaw that the monasteries were going to be ultimately destroyed as much as they were. But yes, Mary was eventually moved to St Mary's Church in St Edmunds. So.
It's strange, isn't it? Because even I'm off to Catherine of Aragon Festival, which is the weekend we're recording this. And yet she was buried in Peterborough, which is again, it's such a strange place for her to be buried, isn't it, really? But anyway, I'm sure they had the reasons for doing what they did. But talking about Mary's life as a mother, it does give us a fascinating glimpse into her personal world. Now, beyond her role in the family, her position in the wider realm had a significant impact, especially as her story comes to an end, because she was not only a princess, but a dowager queen. Do you think her death left a large hole in Henry's life and the country?
Yes. I believe Mary and Henry were very close as siblings. We do have records of before she left for France, which you could argue was his duty because she didn't have any parents left by that point, of him buying her gifts, paying her alms at church services, all of those types of things. But she was always part of his court life in terms of entertainment. So she would partner him in dances and masks. And I think they were close. So she was always writing to Henry. So I do think it would have left a large hole in his life. When she died, he did have masses said for her in London. So I do think it would have impacted him a lot, losing his younger sister, who he'd always been close with. He'd been brought up with her from childhood in the same nursery. As far as the court goes, again, I think she was quite an instrumental part. So he always brought her back to court when they had influential people visiting. So if they had ambassadors or when Charles became emperor and visited England, he brought her back to court and things. So I think she was seen as one of the stars of the court. So they would have lost that. And ultimately, they also would have lost her income from France when she died. So not that it went too directly to Henry, but obviously, they were meant to have been paying huge fines and stuff. And that money would then be kept in France ultimately because they didn't have to pay it anymore. So I think there was financial implications of her death. And obviously Henry's personal loss as well, that he'd lost his younger sister.
I think it's fair to say Mary was a figure of significance in not just in England but also at the French court, and she was clearly, as you mentioned, really close to her brother. But she was also a person not afraid to say what she thought. Now, she lived a life of, as we know, ups and downs. But was it always, in her opinion, was she searching for fairness and justice? And if so, how would you sum up her kind of legacy, I guess?
I think the glimpses that we get from Mary through her own letters, and I know that you could argue as part of the royal family and as a female in the Tudor era, part of it was responsibility, and I do accept that. But we get glimpses of such a charitable person. So she would be constantly asking others for favours for other people. So when she was in France, she was asking Henry to release a man that was held in prison there. And she would argue that, you know, the French would happily pay his ransom. Um, she was looking for teaching positions for her old French tutor, Palsgrave. So he was originally went to France with her as her secretary. But when Louis dismissed her household, he was one of the ones that was dismissed. And she wrote to people asking, can you help him find work in Paris or wherever? And, you know, even up to her death, she was writing to other people asking for favours for people, either within her household or people that she was aware of. And I just think it's them things that make me think her legacy is ultimately her charity. And yes, she did stand up to Henry. I know we've spoken about her marriage to Charles and was she actually close to execution? I don't believe she was, but I think it's, for me, it makes, regardless of what happened with Henry in his later years, I think it gives an understanding of their relationship. And she felt that she could do that. She could stand up to him. So it makes you wonder, was he really the monster that people sometimes make him out to be now? My opinion is no, because the way he treated her and Brandon, to be fair, because, you know, if anyone was going to be at more risk, it would be him. And I think his relationship with them gives insight into Henry and her letters to him and how they wrote to each other tells you that they did have, I know it's not normal in the grand scheme of things because none of us are siblings with a king, but it just gives you insight into that sibling relationship and how she used her influence and her position, not just to help herself and get what she wanted, but to help others around her that weren't royal, that weren't members of the nobility. She was seeking help for people that she felt deserved it, and she was donating to the local monasteries, things like that. So I think for me, her legacy is her charity.
But I think when you mentioned about Henry, I think also, because she was quite young, I think she was around 37 when she died.
Yeah.
So she was still quite young. And Henry's probably latter years were the ones he gets remembered for as being that kind of tyrannical person.
Yeah.
Because I think I understand when he was younger, when he was a young lad growing up, he was a really nice chap. You know, he was friendly, speak to anybody. You know, it was really just, he came across as a really nice person. It's only when he gets to that, I guess, the end of the Catherine of Aragon marriage after 24 years, and he's in his 30s, I guess, by then, isn't he? Or pushing towards that 40 mark. That's when you start to see the changes. I think maybe he was worried that he wasn't going to get that male heir.
Yeah.
And that kind of took over his life, and that made him into the person that he became, if you like, you know. Maybe Mary never saw that bad side. Maybe she only ever saw him as a real nice person. Although perhaps towards the end of her life, but even then, towards the end of her life, she was away from court quite a lot. So perhaps she didn't see that other side to it. I don't know. I mean, we just kind of, it's all assumptions, isn't it, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think who knows what Mary would have thought of what Henry turned into, but I think she saw obviously the younger side, the caring brother, the one that was always fun and having entertainments at court and loved the clothing, loved the dancing. So I think she got the young fun brother. So
Yeah. Anyway, it's now time to talk about Amy. So, where can people find out more about you and information about your books and the Tudors, and any other social media sites you'd like to share?
So I'm on most social media sites, so Facebook, X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. I'm on all of them. It's either my full names or it's Amy Mac Books, but you'll be able to find me on any of them. So my books are available at all the usual places. So, and the first two are on ebook as well as hard copy. So if that's your preference to read ebooks, and Mary will be due out in hardback, hopefully on the 28th of February. So not long to go. But yes, and I'm now finishing up Desiderius Erasmus. So busy bee.
You're busy, aren't you? You're non-stop. Anyway, don't forget, anybody who's watching this, all Amy's links will be in that description box below. So, Amy, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your fascinating insights into Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and the incredible journey behind your new book. It's been wonderful to hear about your passion for uncovering the life of this remarkable Tudor figure and bringing a story to light in such a compelling way. Your dedication to diving into the details and sharing Mary's legacy with readers is also inspiring. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure your book will captivate audiences everywhere.
John, the pleasure is mine. It's been very, very enjoyable to be here, and I do hope that people will join me in bringing Mary into the limelight that she deserves.
All right.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And as always, to everyone who's tuned in today, thank you so much. We've still got some more incredible guests coming on History Speaks. So if you love history, you'll love History Roadshow. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our historical stories. So until next time, keep exploring the past with us, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.